Philip Wayne stood in the doorway of their shared apartment, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched Kyle Robinson pace the length of their living room like a caged animal. The golden afternoon light streaming through their windows caught the copper highlights in Kyle's dark hair, and Philip felt that familiar ache bloom in his chest, the one that had been his constant companion for 2 years and 4 months now. Kyle's hands were moving as he spoke, gesturing wildly in that way that meant he was trying to work through something impossible, something that couldn't quite fit into words. "I can't put it into words," Kyle had said just moments before, his voice breaking on the last syllable. But then he had looked at Philip with those storm gray eyes, and Philip had seen everything Kyle couldn't say written there. In the desperate way his gaze searched Philip's face, like he was trying to transmit his thoughts directly through the space between them. Now Kyle had stopped pacing and was standing in the center of their living room, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. His hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and there was a flush high on his cheekbones that Philip had learned to recognize as the sign that Kyle was fighting some internal battle he wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Philip," Kyle said, and his voice was so soft it was almost a whisper. "Philip, I think I need to tell you something, but I don't know how to say it without everything changing." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, and Philip felt his world tilt on its axis. This was the moment he had dreamed about and dreaded in equal measure. The moment when the careful balance they had maintained for so long would finally shatter. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, standing on the precipice of something that could either save them or destroy everything they had built together, you would need to go back to the beginning, to the day when Philip first realized that his feelings for his best friend had crossed a line he could never uncross. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. It had started 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday evening in late September, when the first hints of autumn were beginning to creep into the air. Philip had been sitting at their kitchen table, grading papers from his introductory psychology classes, when Kyle had burst through the front door with all the energy of a hurricane making landfall. Philip had looked up from his stack of essays to find Kyle standing in their entryway, his jacket half off and his eyes bright with the kind of excitement that usually meant he had either gotten a promotion at the marketing firm where he worked or had finally worked up the courage to ask out whatever girl had caught his attention that week. "You will never believe what happened today," Kyle had announced, dropping his messenger bag by the door and shrugging out of his jacket with movements that were just a little too sharp, a little too quick. Philip had set down his red pen and given Kyle his full attention, the way he always did when Kyle needed to talk through something. Kyle had this way of processing his thoughts out loud, bouncing ideas off Philip like he was a human sounding board, and Philip had long ago accepted his role as Kyle's emotional translator. "Tell me," Philip had said, leaning back in his chair and watching as Kyle began his familiar routine of pacing the length of their kitchen. "Sarah broke up with me," Kyle had said, and Philip had felt his stomach drop even as Kyle continued talking. "She said, and I quote, that I was emotionally unavailable and that she felt like she was dating a ghost." Philip had tried to arrange his features into an expression of appropriate sympathy, even as a treacherous part of his heart had whispered that maybe this was good news. Maybe this meant Kyle was finally free of the endless parade of girlfriends who never seemed to understand him the way Philip did. "I'm sorry," Philip had said, and he had meant it, even if his sorry was more for the pain Kyle was clearly feeling than for the loss of Sarah specifically. "Are you okay?" Stopped pacing and had turned to look at Philip with an expression that was equal parts confused and frustrated. "That's the thing," Kyle had said. "I should be devastated, right? I mean, we were together for 6 months. I should be heartbroken or angry or something. But all I can think about is how she might have been right." "About what?" "About me being emotionally unavailable? About being a ghost." Kyle had run his hands through his hair, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. "She said it felt like I was always holding something back, like there was some part of me that she could never reach no matter how hard she tried." Philip had felt his chest tighten with a familiar mixture of sympathy and longing. He had watched Kyle go through this same cycle with every girlfriend he had ever had, this pattern of initial excitement followed by gradual distance and eventual breakup. And every time Philip had wanted to shake him, and tell him that maybe the problem wasn't the girls. Maybe the problem was that Kyle was looking for something in the wrong places. Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet, Philip had said carefully. The same thing he always said when Kyle's relationships imploded. Kyle had looked at him then with an expression that Philip couldn't quite read, something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. But what if the problem isn't them, Philip? What if the problem is me? What if I'm just fundamentally incapable of feeling the way I'm supposed to feel? The question had hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Philip hadn't been ready to examine too closely. He had felt his pulse quicken, the way it always did when Kyle started asking the kinds of questions that made Philip wonder if maybe, just maybe, Kyle was beginning to figure out what Philip had known for years. "You're not broken, Kyle," Philip had said, and his voice had come out softer than he had intended. You're looking for something specific, something real." Kyle had stared at him for a long moment, and Philip had felt like Kyle was trying to see inside his head, trying to understand something that Philip couldn't give voice to. Then Kyle had crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides and had pulled Philip up from his chair and into a hug that had lasted just a beat too long to be entirely platonic. "Thank you," Kyle had whispered against Philip's ear, and Philip had felt the warmth of Kyle's breath against his skin and had thought, not for the first time, that he was in serious trouble. That had been the beginning of what Philip would later think of as the unraveling, the slow dissolution of the careful boundaries they had maintained for the 2.5 years they had been roommates and best friends. Over the weeks that followed, Kyle had seemed to shed some invisible armor he had been wearing, becoming more tactile, more emotionally open, more willing to have the kinds of conversations that left Philip lying awake at night, wondering if he was reading too much into every glance and touch. It had started small. Kyle had begun sitting closer to Philip on their couch during their weekly movie nights, close enough that their thighs would brush when one of them shifted position. He had started lingering in doorways when Philip was cooking dinner, leaning against the frame and watching Philip move around their kitchen with an intensity that made Philip's skin feel like it was humming with electricity. There had been the night when Kyle had fallen asleep during a late movie and had somehow ended up with his head on Philip's shoulder, his breathing deep and even as Philip had sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement would break the spell and send Kyle retreating back to his own space. Philip had spent those 2 hours cataloging every detail, the weight of Kyle's head against his collarbone, the way Kyle's hand had somehow found its way to rest on Philip's thigh, the soft sounds Kyle made in his sleep. There had been the morning when Philip had woken up to find Kyle making pancakes in their kitchen, wearing nothing but a pair of sleep pants and an old t-shirt that was thin enough to show the outline of his chest. Kyle had looked up when Philip had shuffled in, still half asleep, and had smiled with a warmth that had made Philip's heart skip a beat. "Good morning, sunshine," Kyle had said, and there had been something different in his voice, something that sounded almost like affection. "I made extra because I figured you would be hungry." Philip had accepted the plate of pancakes and had tried not to think about how domestic the whole scene felt, how easy it would be to pretend that this was their real life, that Kyle was making him breakfast because he wanted to take care of him, not just because he had made too much food. But it was the conversations that had really gotten to Philip, the late-night talks that had started happening with increasing frequency. Kyle had developed a habit of knocking on Philip's bedroom door around 11 o'clock at night, usually with some excuse about needing help with a work presentation or wanting to discuss a movie they had watched, but really just seeming to need Philip's company. They would end up sitting on Philip's bed, backs against the headboard, talking about everything and nothing. Kyle would ask questions about Philip's research, about the psychology classes he taught, about human behavior and motivation and the ways people connected with each other. And Philip would answer as best he could, all the while hyper-aware of the way Kyle's knee would bump against his, the way Kyle would turn his whole body toward Philip when he was really listening. One night in early November, Kyle had asked a question that had made Philip's breath catch in his throat. "Do you think some people are just wired differently when it comes to attraction?" Kyle had said, his voice carefully casual in the way that meant he was trying to sound like the question didn't matter when it clearly did. Philip had felt his heart start to race, but he had kept his voice steady as he answered. "What do you mean? Like, what if someone thought they knew what they wanted, but it turned out they were wrong?" What if they had been looking for the wrong things their whole life without realizing it? Philip had turned to look at Kyle, trying to read his expression in the dim light from Philip's bedside lamp. Kyle had been staring at his hands, which were fidgeting with the edge of Philip's comforter, and there had been something vulnerable in his posture that had made Philip want to reach out and touch him. I think, Philip had said carefully, that sometimes people spend so much time trying to fit into what they think they're supposed to want that they don't pay attention to what they actually want. Kyle had looked up at him then, and Philip had seen something in Kyle's eyes that had made his chest tight with hope and terror in equal measure. What if what they actually want is something they never considered before? Kyle had asked, and his voice had been so quiet that Philip had had to lean closer to hear him. Then maybe they should consider it, Philip had said, and the words had felt like they were balanced on a knife's edge, like they could either open a door that neither of them could close or slam it shut forever. Kyle had stared at him for a long moment, and Philip had felt like the air between them was crackling with electricity, like they were standing on the edge of a cliff and one of them was about to jump. But then Kyle had looked away, and the moment had passed, leaving Philip wondering if he had imagined the whole thing. The pattern had continued for weeks, these conversations that danced around the edge of something neither of them seemed ready to name. Kyle would ask his careful questions about attraction and connection and the nature of love, and Philip would answer as honestly as he dared, all the while feeling like they were speaking in code, like they were having two conversations at once. Philip had started paying closer attention to Kyle's behavior, cataloging every glance and gesture like a scientist gathering data. He had noticed the way Kyle's gaze would sometimes linger on Philip's mouth when Philip was talking. He had noticed how Kyle had started finding excuses to touch him, brushing Philip's hand when he passed him a cup of coffee, letting his fingers trail across Philip's shoulder when he walked behind the couch. Most telling of all, Philip had noticed how Kyle had stopped talking about dating, had stopped mentioning other guys he found attractive, had stopped doing all the things that had once been constant reminders to Philip that Kyle was straight and therefore forever out of reach. The shift had been so gradual that Philip might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so carefully, but once he had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. Kyle was changing. Or maybe Kyle was just finally letting himself be who he had always been underneath all the expectations and assumptions. The breaking point had come on a Friday night in mid-November. Philip had been grading papers at the kitchen table when Kyle had come home from work looking like he had been hit by a truck. His usually perfect hair had been disheveled, his tie had been loosened and hanging crooked around his neck, and there had been dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Rough day?" Philip had asked, looking up from his stack of essays. Kyle had dropped his bag by the door and had slumped against the kitchen counter, like his legs wouldn't hold him up anymore. "You could say that," Kyle had said, and his voice had sounded hollow, defeated in a way that Philip had never heard before. Philip had set down his pen and had given Kyle his full attention. What happened? Kyle had been quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor, like he was trying to figure out how to put his thoughts into words. Then he had looked up at Philip, and Philip had seen something raw and desperate in his eyes. "I had coffee with Sarah today," Kyle had said. "She wanted to talk, to get some closure or whatever." Philip had felt his stomach clench, but he had kept his expression neutral. "How did that go? She asked me if I was gay," Kyle had said, and the words had hit Philip like a physical blow. Just like that, straight to the point. She said she had been thinking about our relationship, about why it never worked, and she had come to the conclusion that maybe I was just not attracted to women. Philip had felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. "What did you tell her?" Kyle had laughed, but there had been no humor in it. "I told her she was crazy. I told her that of course I'm attracted to women, that I had dated plenty of women, that just because our relationship didn't work out didn't mean I was gay." Philip had nodded, trying to ignore the way his heart was sinking. "That makes sense, does it?" Kyle had asked, and there had been something desperate in his voice. "Because I've been thinking about what she said, and Philip, I can't stop thinking about it." Kyle had pushed away from the counter and had started pacing, running his hands through his hair in that way that meant he was trying to work through something impossible. "What if she's right?" Kyle had said. "What if I've been lying to myself this whole time? What if the reason none of my relationships work is because I'm trying to force myself to feel something I'm just not capable of feeling? Philip had felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, like the next words out of his mouth could either save them both or destroy everything they had built together. "Kyle," he had said carefully, "what are you saying?" Kyle had stopped pacing and had turned to look at Philip, and Philip had seen something in Kyle's eyes that had made his breath catch in his throat. "I'm saying that maybe Sarah was right," Kyle had said. "I'm saying that maybe I've been looking for love in all the wrong places because I was too scared to look in the right one." The words had hung in the air between them like a confession, and Philip had felt his world shift on its axis. This was the moment he had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. The moment when everything would change. "Kyle," Philip had said, and his voice had come out as barely more than a whisper. "I know this is crazy," Kyle had said, taking a step closer to Philip's chair. "I know this probably doesn't make any sense, but, Philip, I think I might be in love with you." The words had hit Philip like lightning, illuminating everything that had been hidden in shadow. All those late-night conversations, all those lingering touches, all those moments when Philip had thought he was imagining the electricity between them, suddenly it all made sense. Philip had stood up from his chair, his legs shaky with adrenaline, and had looked at Kyle, really looked at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. "How long?" Philip had asked. Kyle had run his hands through his hair again, and Philip had seen that his hands were trembling. "I don't know," Kyle had said. "Maybe forever. Maybe since the day we moved in together and you helped me unpack my books and you knew exactly how I wanted them organized without me having to tell you. Maybe since the first time you made me laugh when I was having a terrible day. Maybe since I realized that coming home to you was the best part of every day." Philip had felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, and he had reached out without thinking, cupping Kyle's face in his hands. "Kyle," Philip had said, "I need you to know something." Kyle had leaned into Philip's touch, his eyes fluttering closed for just a moment. "What?" "I've been in love with you for 2 years and 4 months," Philip had said. "Since the day you moved in. Since the first time you smiled at me. Since the moment I realized that you were the most beautiful person I had ever seen, inside and out." Kyle's eyes had snapped open, and Philip had seen wonder and disbelief and hope all warring in his expression. "Really?" Kyle had whispered. "Really," Philip had said, and then Kyle had been kissing him, soft and tentative at first, like he wasn't sure Philip would kiss him back, and then deeper, more certain, when Barsh Philip had responded with all the passion he had been holding back for years. The kiss had been everything Philip had imagined and nothing like what he had expected. Kyle's lips had been soft and warm, and he had tasted like the coffee he had been drinking, and something that was uniquely Kyle. Philip had felt like he was drowning and being saved at the same time, like every nerve ending in his body had suddenly come alive. When they had finally broken apart, both breathing hard, Kyle had rested his forehead against Philip's and had smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks. "So what now?" Kyle had whispered. "Now," Philip had said, brushing his thumb across Kyle's cheekbone, "we figure it out together." That had been the beginning of everything. Over the weeks that followed, they had navigated the transition from friends to something more with a care and tenderness that had made Philip's heart ache in the best possible way. They had talked for hours about what it meant, about how Kyle's understanding of himself had shifted, about the way Philip had been quietly in love with him for so long. Kyle had been full of questions about himself, about them, about what it meant to love another man. He had asked Philip about when Philip had first realized he was gay, about how he had come to terms with it, about whether he thought Kyle had always known on some level, but had been too scared to admit it. I think Philip had told him one night as they lay tangled together in Philip's bed, fully clothed but closer than they had ever been, that some people just know who they are from the beginning, and some people have to discover it along the way. Neither way is wrong. Kyle had been quiet for a moment, tracing patterns on Philip's chest with his fingertip. "I keep thinking about all those relationships that didn't work," Kyle had said. "All those women I hurt because I couldn't give them what they needed. I feel terrible about it." "You were trying to be who you thought you were supposed to be," Philip had said. "That doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you human." Kyle had looked up at him then, and Philip had seen gratitude and love and something that looked like relief in his eyes. "I love you," Kyle had said, And it had been the first time he had said it since that night in the kitchen. The first time it hadn't been part of a confession or an apology, but just a simple statement of fact. I love you too, Philip had said, and he had meant it with every fiber of his being. They had taken things slowly, learning each other in ways that went beyond the friendship they had shared. Kyle had been hesitant at first, unsure of himself in this new territory, but Philip had been patient, letting Kyle set the pace, letting him discover what he wanted and needed. There had been long conversations about what their relationship meant, about how to navigate the practical aspects of being together. Kyle had been worried about telling his family, about coming out at work, about all the ways his life would change now that he understood who he was. Philip had helped him through it all, holding his hand when Kyle had called his parents, being there when Kyle had awkward conversations with his coworkers, supporting him through every moment of doubt and fear and uncertainty. The first time Kyle had introduced Philip as his boyfriend rather than his roommate had been at a party thrown by one of Kyle's colleagues from work. Philip had seen the way Kyle's hand had trembled slightly when he had made the introduction, had seen the flash of nervousness in Kyle's eyes, and had squeezed Kyle's hand reassuringly. Afterward, as they had walked home through the crisp December air, Kyle had been quiet, lost in thought. "How do you feel?" Philip had asked. Kyle had been quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Scared," Kyle had said finally, "but also relieved. Like I've been holding my breath for years and I can finally exhale." Philip had stopped walking and had pulled Kyle into his arms right there on the sidewalk, kissing him under the glow of a streetlight. "I'm proud of you," Philip had said against Kyle's lips. Kyle had smiled, and Philip had seen that the smile reached all the way to his eyes. The holidays had been a revelation. They had spent Christmas with Philip's family, who had welcomed Kyle with open arms and had treated him like he had always been part of the family. Kyle had been nervous beforehand, worried about being accepted, but Philip's parents had made it clear that anyone who made Philip happy was welcome in their home. Philip had watched Kyle relax over the course of the long weekend, had seen him laugh and joke with Philip's siblings, had seen him help Philip's mother in the kitchen and discuss sports with Philip's father. It had felt like the most natural thing in the world, like Kyle had always belonged there. On Christmas morning, Kyle had given Philip a gift that had made Philip's eyes fill with tears. It had been a leather-bound journal, and on the first page, Kyle had written a note in his careful handwriting. "For all the words I couldn't say before, and all the ones I want to say now. I love you, Philip. Thank you for waiting for me to figure it out." Philip had given Kyle a key to his heart, literally a vintage skeleton key on a chain that Kyle could wear close to his heart. "You've always had it," Philip had said as Kyle had fastened the chain around his neck. "I just wanted to make it official." The new year had brought new challenges and new joys. Kyle had started seeing a therapist to work through some of the confusion and self-doubt that came with his late-in-life realization about his sexuality. Philip had been supportive, understanding that Kyle needed space to process everything that had changed in his life. There had been difficult days when Kyle had questioned everything, when he had wondered if he was just confused, if maybe he was just projecting his feelings for Philip onto all men. Philip had been patient during these moments, reassuring Kyle that his feelings were valid, that there was no timeline for self-discovery, that love was love regardless of when you found it. There had also been beautiful days when Kyle had seemed to settle into his new understanding of himself with a confidence that took Philip's breath away. Days when Kyle would kiss Philip goodbye in the morning like it was the most natural thing in the world, when he would hold Philip's hand in public without a second thought, when he would talk about their future together with a certainty that made Philip's heart soar. One evening in late January, they had been cooking dinner together, moving around their kitchen with the easy rhythm they had developed over months of domestic bliss, when Kyle had suddenly stopped stirring the sauce he was making and had turned to look at Philip. "I need to tell you something," Kyle had said, and there had been something in his voice that had made Philip set down the knife he had been using to chop vegetables. "What is it?" Philip had asked, turning to face Kyle fully. Kyle had taken a deep breath, and Philip had seen that his hands were shaking slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about what Sarah said, about me being emotionally unavailable, about feeling like I was dating a ghost." Philip had felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in his chest, but he had kept his expression calm. "Okay, she was right," Kyle had said. "I was emotionally unavailable." I was a ghost. But it wasn't because I was broken or incapable of love. It was because I was trying to love people I wasn't meant to love, trying to force myself into a shape that didn't fit. Kyle had stepped closer to Philip, reaching out to take Philip's hands in his own. With you, Kyle had continued, I'm not a ghost. With you, I'm more myself than I've ever been. With you, I'm real. Philip had felt tears spring to his eyes at the raw honesty in Kyle's voice. You've always been real to me, Philip had said. Even when you were trying to be someone else, even when you were confused about what you wanted, you were always real to me. Kyle had smiled then, and it had been the kind of smile that could light up a room. I want to spend the rest of my life being real with you, Kyle had said. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to build a life with you that's authentic and honest and full of love. Philip had felt like his heart might burst from the sheer joy of it all. Is that a proposal? Philip had asked, only half joking. Kyle had laughed, and the sound had been pure happiness. Not yet, Kyle had said. But someday when we're ready, when we've figured out all the details, yes, I want to marry you, Philip Nguyen. I want to be yours for the rest of my life. Philip had kissed him then, pouring all his love and gratitude and hope into the connection between them. The months that followed had been a blur of happiness and growth and discovery. They had traveled together, taking a trip to San Francisco where they had walked hand in hand through the Castro district and had felt the profound sense of belonging that came with being surrounded by their community. Kyle had marveled at the rainbow flags flying from every storefront, at the couples walking openly down the street, at the sense of pride and joy that permeated everything. This is what it feels like to be free, Kyle had said, as they had sat in Dolores Park, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Philip had squeezed Kyle's hand and had thought about how far they had both come, how much courage it had taken for Kyle to embrace this new understanding of himself, how grateful Philip was to be part of Kyle's journey. They had also faced challenges. Kyle's parents had struggled initially with his coming out, not because they didn't love him, but because they had to readjust their understanding of who their son was. There had been awkward family dinners and difficult conversations, but gradually Kyle's family had come to accept and even embrace Philip as part of their family. Kyle had also dealt with some backlash at work, colleagues who had made inappropriate comments or had treated him differently once they learned he was gay. But Kyle had handled it all with a grace and dignity that had made Philip fall even more in love with him, if that was possible. Through it all, their relationship had only grown stronger. They had learned to communicate in ways that went beyond words, to support each other through difficult times, to celebrate each other's victories and growth. By the time spring arrived, they had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. They had their morning routine of coffee and newspaper reading, their evening ritual of cooking dinner together and talking about their days, their weekend adventures exploring the city and spending time with friends who had become like family. Philip had watched Kyle bloom over those months, had seen him grow into his authentic self with a confidence and joy that was beautiful to witness. Kyle had started volunteering at a local LGBTQ youth center, mentoring teenagers who were struggling with their own identity questions. He had found purpose in helping others navigate the same journey he had been on. I wish I had had someone like you when I was 18, Kyle had told Philip one evening after a particularly rewarding day at the center. Someone to tell me that it was okay to question everything I thought I knew about myself. You're that person for them now, Philip had replied. You're showing them that it's never too late to discover who you really are. Kyle had smiled and had pulled Philip close, and Philip had marveled at how perfectly they fit together, how right it felt to be held by this man who had become his whole world. One evening in early May, as they had been sitting on their couch reading, Kyle had suddenly closed his book and had turned to look at Philip in an expression that Philip had learned to recognize, working up the courage to say something important. Philip, Kyle had said, and there had been something in his voice that had made Philip set aside his own book and give Kyle his full attention. What is it? Philip had asked. Kyle had taken a deep breath, and Philip had seen that familiar flutter of nervousness in Kyle's eyes that appeared whenever he was about to venture into emotional territory. I've been thinking about what you said that night, about how you've been in love with me for 2 years and 4 months, Kyle had said, about how you waited for me to figure myself out. how you supported me through all my confusion and doubt. Philip had felt his chest tighten with emotion, remembering those long months of loving Kyle from a distance, of watching him struggle through relationships that never quite worked, of hoping and fearing in equal measure. You didn't have to wait for me, Kyle had continued. You could have told me how you felt years ago. You could have saved us both a lot of pain and confusion. Philip had reached out to take Kyle's hand, intertwining their fingers the way they always did when they needed to feel connected. I couldn't risk losing you, Philip had said honestly. Your friendship was too important to me. I would rather have loved you silently for the rest of my life than lose you completely. Kyle had squeezed Philip's hand, and Philip had seen tears gathering in Kyle's eyes. But don't you see, Kyle had said, his voice thick with emotion, you were never going to lose me. Even when I didn't understand what I was feeling. Even when I was trying to force myself to love other people, you were always the most important person in my life. You were always the one I came home to, the one I wanted to talk to about everything, the one who made me feel like myself. Philip had felt his own eyes fill with tears at the raw honesty in Kyle's voice. I love you for waiting for me, Kyle had continued. I love you for being patient while I figured out who I was. I love you for never making me feel broken or wrong for being confused. But mostly I love you for seeing who I really was before I could see it myself. Philip had pulled Kyle into his arms then, holding him close and breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and skin. I would wait for you again, Philip had whispered against Kyle's ear. I would wait forever if I had to. Kyle had pulled back to look at Philip, and Philip had seen love and gratitude and something that looked like awe in Kyle's expression. You'll never have to wait again, Kyle had said. I'm here now. I'm yours now. And I'm never going anywhere. They had made love that night with a tenderness and passion that had left them both breathless and overwhelmed. Afterward, as they had lain tangled together in the darkness, Kyle had traced patterns on Philip's chest and had spoken in a voice soft with contentment. I used to think that love was supposed to be complicated, Kyle had said. All those relationships that didn't work, all that drama and confusion and heartbreak. I thought that was just what love was. Philip had run his fingers through Kyle's hair, marveling at how soft it was, how perfectly Kyle fit against his side. And now, Philip had asked? Now I know that real love is actually simple, Kyle had said. It's coming home to someone who sees you completely and loves you anyway. It's feeling safe enough to be vulnerable, brave enough to be honest, confident enough to be yourself. Philip had felt his heart swell with so much love, he thought it might burst. It's finding your person, Kyle had continued, and knowing that whatever happens, you'll face it together. Philip had tilted Kyle's chin up so he could see his face in the dim light from the window. You're my person, Philip had said. You've always been my person. Kyle had smiled, and Philip had seen their whole future reflected in that smile. All the years of love and laughter and growth and adventure that lay ahead of them. I love you, Philip Nguyen, Kyle had said. Thank you for waiting for me to come home to myself. The summer had passed in a blur of happiness and deepening connection. They had attended Pride together for the first time, Kyle wearing a rainbow shirt that Philip had bought him and holding Philip's hand as they had walked through the crowds of celebrating people. Philip had watched Kyle's face light up with wonder and joy as he had taken in the diversity and acceptance around them. The families with rainbow flags, the couples of all ages and backgrounds celebrating their love openly. This is incredible, Kyle had said, his voice full of amazement. All these people, just being themselves, just loving who they love. Philip had squeezed Kyle's hand and had thought about his own first Pride, years before he had met Kyle, when he had been young and uncertain and desperately in need of community. Seeing it through Kyle's eyes had made it feel new again, had reminded Philip of the profound gift of belonging. They had danced together at the street party afterward, Kyle's arms around Philip's waist, as they had swayed to music that had seemed to come from everywhere at once. Philip had felt like they were at the center of the universe, surrounded by love and acceptance, and the kind of joy that came from being exactly who you were meant to be. I want to come back next year, Kyle had said as they had walked home that evening, both of them sunburned and exhausted and completely happy. We will, Philip had promised. Every year, for as long as you want." Kyle had stopped walking and had pulled Philip into his arms right there on the sidewalk, kissing him with a passion that had made Philip's knees weak. "Forever," Kyle had said against Philip's lips. "I want to come back forever." As summer had turned to fall, they had begun to talk more seriously about their future together. Kyle had brought up the idea of moving to a bigger apartment, somewhere with space for a home office for Philip and room for Kyle's growing collection of books about LGBTQ history and culture. He had been reading voraciously, trying to understand the community he had become part of, eager to learn about the struggles and triumphs of those who had come before. "I feel like I have so much catching up to do," Kyle had said one evening as he had looked up from a biography of Harvey Milk. "All this history, all these stories of people who fought for the rights we have now. I wish I had known about it sooner." "You know about it now," Philip had said. "That's what matters." Kyle had set the book aside and had moved closer to Philip on the couch. "I want to be part of it," Kyle had said. "I want to contribute something, to give back to the community that's welcomed me so openly." Philip had felt a surge of pride and love for this man who had embraced his authentic self so completely, who had found purpose and meaning in his new understanding of who he was. "What are you thinking?" Philip had asked. Kyle had taken Philip's hand, intertwining their fingers the way he always did when he was thinking through something important. "I want to start a support group," Kyle had said, "for people like me, people who figured out their sexuality later in life. I know there are others out there who are struggling with the same questions I struggled with." Philip had felt his heart swell with admiration for Kyle's courage and compassion. "I think that's an incredible idea," Philip had said. "You would be amazing at that." Kyle had smiled, and Philip had seen the confidence and purpose that had grown in Kyle over the months since he had come out. "Will you help me?" Kyle had asked. "I know you have experience with group dynamics from your psychology background. I could use your expertise." Philip had leaned over to kiss Kyle softly, tasting the coffee Kyle had been drinking, and something that was uniquely him. "Of course," Philip had said. "We're a team now, remember? Whatever you want to do, we'll do it together." The support group had become a reality by October, meeting weekly in the community center where Kyle volunteered. Philip had watched with pride and amazement as Kyle had facilitated discussions with men and women of all ages who were questioning their sexuality, providing the kind of understanding and acceptance that Kyle himself had needed during his own journey. The first meeting had been small, just 5 people sitting in a circle and tentatively sharing their stories. But word had spread, and by December they had nearly 20 regular attendees and a waiting list of people who wanted to join. Philip had attended every meeting, not as a facilitator but as support for Kyle, watching from the back of the room as Kyle had helped others navigate the same confusion and self-doubt he had experienced. Philip had seen Kyle grow into his role as a leader and mentor, had watched him develop the skills to help others find their authentic selves. One evening after a particularly emotional meeting, Kyle had been quiet on the drive home, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" Philip had asked as they had pulled into their parking spot. Kyle had been quiet for a moment, staring out the windshield at their apartment building. "That man tonight," Kyle had said finally, "the one who's been married for 20 years and just realized he's gay." The pain in his eyes when he talked about feeling like he's been living a lie. Philip had reached over to take Kyle's hand, feeling the tension in Kyle's fingers. "You helped him tonight," Philip had said. "You showed him that he's not alone, that there's hope for him to find happiness and authenticity." Kyle had turned to look at Philip, and Philip had seen the weight of responsibility and compassion in Kyle's eyes. "I keep thinking about how different my story could have been," Kyle had said. "If I hadn't had you, if I hadn't had your patience and love and support. What if I had been alone when I figured this out?" Philip had squeezed Kyle's hand, understanding the depth of Kyle's empathy for the people in their group. "But you weren't alone," Philip had said, "and now you're making sure that others don't have to be alone either. You're giving them what you had, what everyone deserves." Kyle had smiled then, and Philip had seen the peace that came from knowing you were living your purpose. "I love you," Kyle had said. "Thank you for helping me become who I was meant to be." Winter had arrived with a vengeance, blanketing their city in snow and turning their apartment into a cozy refuge from the cold. They had spent their evenings curled up together on the couch, reading or watching movies, or simply talking about their days. Philip had marveled at how comfortable they had become with each other, how natural it felt to share space and silence, and the small intimacies of daily life. One snowy evening in February, as they had been making dinner together, Kyle had been unusually quiet, moving around the kitchen with a distracted air that Philip had learned to recognize as Kyle working through something important. "You're thinking about something," Philip had observed, looking up from the salad he was preparing. Kyle had paused in his stirring of the pasta sauce and had turned to look at Philip with an expression that was equal parts nervous and excited. "I am," Kyle had admitted. "I've been thinking about it for weeks, actually." Philip had set down his knife and had given Kyle his full attention. "What is it?" Kyle had taken a deep breath, and Philip had seen that familiar flutter of nervousness in Kyle's eyes that appeared whenever he was about to venture into important emotional territory. "I want to ask you something," Kyle had said, his voice careful and measured. "But I'm not sure how to bring it up." Philip had felt his pulse quicken, recognizing the tone Kyle used when he was working up to something significant. "Just ask," Philip had said gently. "Whatever it is, we can talk about it." Kyle had set down the spoon he had been using and had turned to face Philip fully, leaning back against the counter. "How do you feel about marriage?" Kyle had asked, and Philip had felt his heart skip a beat. "Marriage," Philip had repeated, trying to keep his voice steady even as his mind had raced with possibilities. Kyle had nodded, his eyes searching Philip's face for any sign of his reaction. "I know we've talked about it before," Kyle had said, his words coming faster now, as if he was afraid he would lose his nerve if he didn't get them out quickly. "About wanting to spend our lives together, about building something real and lasting. But I mean actually getting married, legally, officially." Philip had felt a surge of joy so intense it had taken his breath away. But he had tried to keep his expression calm, not wanting to overwhelm Kyle with his enthusiasm. "I think," Philip had said carefully, "that I would love nothing more than to marry you." Kyle's face had broken into a smile so bright it could have lit up the entire apartment. "Really?" Kyle had asked, and Philip had heard the hope and excitement in his voice. "Really," Philip had confirmed, stepping closer to Kyle and reaching out to cup his face in his hands. "I've been thinking about it too, actually, about what it would mean to make that kind of commitment to each other, to have our love recognized officially." Kyle had leaned into Philip's touch, his eyes fluttering closed for just a moment. "I want that," Kyle had said, opening his eyes to look directly at Philip. "I want to stand up in front of our families and friends and promise to love you for the rest of my life. I want to wear your ring and have you wear mine. I want to be your husband." Philip had felt tears spring to his eyes at the raw honesty and love in Kyle's voice. "I want that too," Philip had said, his voice thick with emotion. More than anything, Kyle had pulled Philip into his arms then, holding him close and tight as if he never wanted to let him go. "So we're really going to do this?" Kyle had asked, his voice muffled against Philip's shoulder. "We're really going to do this," Philip had confirmed, and he had felt like his heart might burst from the sheer joy of it all. They had spent the rest of the evening talking about their vision for their wedding, about whether they wanted something big or small, formal or casual, traditional or uniquely their own. Kyle had been full of ideas, excited about the prospect of celebrating their love with everyone who mattered to them. "I want my parents to walk me down the aisle," Kyle had said as they had sat on the couch later, Philip's arms around him. "I want them to be part of this, to see how happy you make me." Philip had felt his chest tighten with emotion, thinking about how far Kyle had come with his family, how much courage it had taken for him to be honest with them about who he was. "They will be," Philip had said. "They love you, and they can see how much we love each other." Kyle had tilted his head up to look at Philip, and Philip had seen gratitude and wonder and pure happiness in his expression. "2 years ago, I thought I knew what my life was going to look like," Callum had said. "I thought I would eventually marry some woman I could never quite connect with, have kids because that's what was expected, live a life that felt like I was playing a role in someone else's story." Philip had tightened his arms around Kyle, thinking about how different both their lives would have been if Kyle had never found the courage to question his assumptions about himself. "And now," Philip had asked, "now I know that I get to marry my best friend," Kyle had said. "I get to wake up every morning next to the person who knows me better than I know myself. I get to build a life that's authentic and real and full of love." Philip had kissed the top of Kyle's head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "We both get that," Philip had said. "We both get to be exactly who we are, with someone who loves us completely." Spring had brought with it a flurry of wedding planning activity. They had decided on a small ceremony in the garden behind the community center, where Kyle ran his support group, surrounded by the people who had been part of their journey. Kyle had thrown himself into the planning with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything he cared about, researching vendors and venues and flowers with a dedication that had made Philip fall even more in love with him. Philip had watched Kyle navigate the world of wedding planning with a joy and excitement that had been beautiful to witness. Kyle had been particularly excited about choosing their rings, spending hours researching different styles and metals and designs. "I want something that will remind me of you every time I look at it," Kyle had said as they had browsed through jewelry stores on a sunny Saturday afternoon. They had finally found the perfect rings at a small, independent jeweler who specialized in custom designs for same-sex couples. The rings were simple platinum bands with a subtle wave pattern that caught the light when they moved, elegant and timeless and uniquely theirs. The jeweler had been an older woman with kind eyes who had clearly been moved by their story when Kyle had enthusiastically explained how they had met and fallen in love. "You two remind me of my own daughter and her wife," the jeweler had said, as she had sized their fingers. "That same look of absolute certainty that you found your person." Philip had squeezed Kyle's hand and had thought about how right that felt. That sense of certainty, of knowing without a doubt that Kyle was his person and always would be. As their wedding day had approached, Kyle had become increasingly emotional, overcome by the magnitude of what they were about to commit to. One evening in early June, just 2 weeks before their ceremony, Kyle had been sitting on their bed looking through the vows he had been working on when Philip had found him crying. "Hey," Philip had said softly, sitting down next to Kyle and pulling him into his arms. "What's wrong?" Kyle had wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, but the tears had kept coming. "I'm just so grateful," Kyle had said, his voice thick with emotion. "I keep thinking about how close I came to never figuring this out, to spending my whole life trying to be someone I wasn't. And then I think about you, waiting for me all that time, loving me even when I couldn't love myself the way I needed to." Philip had felt his own eyes fill with tears at the raw vulnerability in Kyle's voice. "You did figure it out," Philip had said, cupping Kyle's face in his hands. "You found the courage to be honest with yourself, to embrace who you really are. That takes incredible strength." Kyle had leaned into Philip's touch, closing his eyes and taking a shaky breath. "I just want to be worthy of this," Kyle had said. "Of you, of the love we have, of the life we're building together." Philip had tilted Kyle's chin up so he could look directly into his eyes. "You are worthy," Philip had said firmly. "You are worthy of love, worthy of happiness, worthy of a life that feels authentic and real. Don't ever doubt that." Kyle had smiled through his tears, and Philip had seen the love and trust and absolute faith Kyle had in him, in them, in their future together. "I love you," Kyle had said. "I can't wait to marry you." Their wedding day had dawned clear and perfect, with a gentle breeze that had made the flowers in the community center garden dance and sway. Philip had stood at the altar, watching as Kyle had walked down the aisle with his parents on either side of him, and had felt like his heart might burst from the sheer joy and love and gratitude that had filled every cell of his body. Kyle had been radiant in his navy blue suit, his face glowing with happiness as he had made his way toward Philip. When their eyes had met, Kyle had smiled with such pure joy that Philip had felt tears spring to his eyes. The ceremony had been perfect in its simplicity, filled with personal touches that had reflected their journey together. Kyle's sister had read a poem about finding your way home, and Philip's best friend from graduate school had officiated, speaking about the courage it took to live authentically and the beauty of love that transcended expectations and assumptions. When it had come time for vows, Kyle had spoken first, his voice strong and clear despite the tears that had been streaming down his face. "Philip," Kyle had said, looking directly into Philip's eyes, "2 years ago, I thought I knew who I was and what I wanted. I was wrong about almost everything except one thing. I was right that you were the most important person in my life. I just didn't understand why yet." Philip had felt his own tears start to fall as Kyle had continued. "You waited for me to find my way home to myself, and in doing so you helped me find my way home to you. You loved me when I was confused. supported me when I was scared, and celebrated with me when I finally understood who I was meant to be. Kyle had paused to take a shaky breath, and Philip had seen the overwhelming love and gratitude in his expression. I promise to love you with the same patience and kindness you showed me. I promise to support your dreams the way you supported mine. I promise to be your partner in every adventure, your comfort in every storm, your companion for every ordinary Tuesday for the rest of our lives. Philip had been crying openly by the time Kyle had finished, overwhelmed by the beauty and honesty of his words. When it had been Philip's turn, he had looked at Kyle and had felt like he was seeing him clearly for the first time. This beautiful man who had found the courage to embrace his authentic self and choose love over fear. Kyle, Philip had said, his voice steady despite his tears, I fell in love with you before you knew who you really were. And I have fallen more in love with you every day as you have become more yourself. Philip had paused, thinking about all the moments that had led them to this one, all the conversations and discoveries and small revelations that had brought them here. You have taught me that love is not about changing someone or fixing them or waiting for them to become who you want them to be. Love is about seeing someone completely, accepting them fully, and supporting them as they grow into who they are meant to be. Philip had reached out to take Kyle's hands, feeling the slight tremor in Kyle's fingers that spoke of overwhelming emotion. I promise to continue seeing you, all of you, for the rest of our lives. I promise to support you as you continue to grow and change and discover new parts of yourself. I promise to build a life with you that is honest and authentic and full of the kind of love that makes everything else possible. The exchange of rings had been a moment of pure magic, Kyle's hands shaking slightly as he had slipped the platinum band onto Philip's finger, his eyes never leaving Philip's face. When Philip had placed Kyle's ring on his finger, Kyle had let out a small sob of joy that had made everyone in the garden smile through their own tears. When the officiant had pronounced them married and told them they could kiss, Kyle had launched himself into Philip's arms with such enthusiasm that they had both laughed through their tears. The kiss had been soft and sweet and full of promise, a seal on the commitment they had just made to each other. The reception had been a celebration of love and community and the beauty of authentic living. Kyle's parents had given a toast about how proud they were of their son for finding the courage to be himself and for finding someone who loved him so completely. Philip's mother had spoken about the woman of watching her son find his perfect match and the blessing of gaining another son. As the evening had wound down and their guests had begun to leave, Kyle and Philip had found themselves alone in the garden, still in their wedding clothes, swaying together to music that existed only in their hearts. How does it feel to be married? Philip had asked, his arms around Kyle's waist as they had moved together in the gentle evening breeze. Kyle had been quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything important. It feels like coming home, Kyle had said finally, like everything that came before was just preparation for this moment, this life, this love. Philip had tightened his arms around Kyle, thinking about how perfectly Kyle fit against him, how right it felt to call this man his husband. I love you, Mr. Robinson, Philip had said, testing out Kyle's new name and finding that he liked the sound of it. Kyle had pulled back to look at Philip, his eyes bright with joy and mischief. I love you too, Mr. Robinson, Kyle had said, and they had both dissolved into laughter at the absurdity and perfection of sharing a name, of being officially and legally and completely each other's. The months that followed their wedding had been a period of settling into their new life as a married couple. They had moved into a larger apartment with space for Philip's home office and Kyle's ever-growing library of LGBTQ literature. Kyle's support group had expanded into multiple groups serving different populations, and Philip had started teaching a graduate seminar on identity development and sexual orientation. They had traveled together for their honeymoon, spending 2 weeks in Europe visiting cities with rich LGBTQ histories. Kyle had been fascinated by everything they had learned, from the early gay rights movements in Berlin to the vibrant queer culture of Amsterdam. Philip had watched Kyle absorb it all with the same enthusiasm and curiosity that had drawn Philip to him in the first place. One evening, as they had sat in a cafe in Paris, watching the world go by and marveling at how far they had traveled, both literally and figuratively, Kyle had reached across the table to take Philip's hand. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't figured it out? Kyle had asked, his thumb tracing patterns on Philip's wedding ring. Philip had considered the question, thinking about all the different ways their story could have unfolded. Sometimes Philip had admitted, but then I remember that love like ours doesn't just disappear. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe it would have happened differently. But I believe we would have found our way to each other eventually. Kyle had smiled, and Philip had seen the contentment and security that had grown in Kyle over the years since he had first realized his feelings for Philip. I'm glad we don't have to find out, Kyle had said. I'm glad we get to have this life, this love, this future together. Philip had lifted Kyle's hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to his wedding ring. Me too, Philip had said. Me too. As they had sat there in that Parisian cafe, surrounded by the gentle hum of conversation in a dozen different languages, Philip had thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The years of friendship and hidden longing, the gradual awakening to truth, the courage it had taken for Kyle to embrace his authentic self, the patience and love that had sustained them through every challenge and change. Now, standing in their living room on this golden afternoon in late October, almost exactly 1 year since Kyle had first confessed his love, Philip looked at his husband and felt that same overwhelming gratitude and joy that had sustained him through every day of their relationship. Kyle had stopped pacing and was looking at Philip with an expression that was equal parts vulnerable and determined. I've been thinking about what you said that night, Kyle said, his voice soft but steady, about how you would have waited for me forever if you had to. Philip felt his chest tighten with emotion, remembering that conversation from so many months ago. I meant it, Philip said. Every word. I know you did, Kyle said, stepping closer until he was standing just arm's length away from Philip. And I've been thinking about how incredible that is, how rare it is to find someone who loves you enough to wait while you figure out who you are. Philip reached out to take Kyle's hands, feeling the familiar comfort of their fingers intertwining. You were worth waiting for, Philip said. You've always been worth waiting for. Kyle smiled, and Philip saw love and gratitude and something that looked like wonder in his expression. I don't want you to have to wait anymore, Kyle said. Not for anything. I want to give you everything, Philip. I want to spend the rest of our lives making up for all the time we lost while I was figuring things out. Philip felt tears spring to his eyes at the raw honesty and love in Kyle's voice. We didn't lose any time, Philip said firmly. Every moment, even the difficult ones, brought us here, brought us to this. Kyle stepped even closer until they were almost touching, until Philip could feel the warmth radiating from Kyle's skin. I love you, Philip Nguyen Robinson, Kyle said, and Philip felt his heart skip a beat at hearing their shared names spoken with such reverence and joy. I love you too, Kyle Robinson, Philip said, and then Kyle was kissing him, soft and sweet and full of all the words they had said and all the words they didn't need to say. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Kyle rested his forehead against Philip's and smiled with the kind of joy that could light up the entire world. So what now? Kyle asked, echoing the question he had asked that first night in their kitchen when everything had changed. Now, Philip said, brushing his thumb across Kyle's cheekbone in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing, we live happily ever after. Kyle laughed, and the sound was pure happiness, pure contentment, pure love. I like the sound of that, Kyle said. I like the sound of that very much. As the golden afternoon light continued to stream through their windows, casting everything in a warm, honey-colored glow, Philip thought about how perfect this moment was, how perfectly it captured everything they had built together. The apartment that had become their sanctuary, filled with books and photographs and the accumulated treasures of a life shared, the easy intimacy between them, the way they moved around each other like dancers who had been practicing the same routine for years. The absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. This was what love looked like when it was allowed to grow and flourish without shame or fear or the need to hide. This was what happened when two people found the courage to be exactly who they were meant to be, together. Philip pulled Kyle close, holding him tight and breathing in the familiar scent of his skin, thinking about all the adventures that lay ahead of them. The support groups Kyle wanted to expand, the research Philip wanted to pursue, the trips they wanted to take, the family they might build together someday. All of it felt possible now. All of it felt within reach. But mostly, Philip just felt grateful. Grateful for Kyle's courage in questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. Grateful for the patience that had allowed their love to unfold in its own time. Grateful for the community that had welcomed them and supported them and celebrated their love. Grateful for the simple, extraordinary miracle of finding your person and getting to build a life with them. As they stood there in their living room, wrapped in each other's arms and bathed in golden light, Philip understood that this was just the beginning. They had the rest of their lives to love each other, to grow together, to discover new depths of connection and intimacy and joy. The thought filled him with such profound happiness that he felt like he might float away if Kyle wasn't there to anchor him to the earth. "I love our life," Kyle murmured against Philip's ear, as if he had been reading Philip's thoughts. "So do I," Philip said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "So do I." Outside their windows, the city continued its daily rhythm, people hurrying home from work and school, couples walking hand in hand down tree-lined streets, families gathering around dinner tables. But inside their apartment, time seemed to slow down, allowing them this moment of perfect peace and contentment. This was what they had been building toward all along, Philip realized. Not just the wedding or the legal recognition or the public declaration of their commitment. This quiet, ordinary, extraordinary moment of being exactly where they belonged, with exactly the right person, living exactly the life they were meant to live. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, Philip thought, remembering something Kyle had said during one of their late-night conversations months ago. Sometimes the greatest gift is discovering that the person you've been looking for has been right there beside you all along. Kyle pulled back to look at Philip, and Philip saw their whole future reflected in Kyle's eyes. All the years of love and laughter and growth and adventure that lay ahead of them. All the ordinary Tuesdays and extraordinary celebrations. All the challenges they would face together and all the joys they would share. "Ready for the rest of our lives?" Kyle asked. And Philip heard the promise and the question and the absolute certainty in his voice. "With you," Philip said, cupping Kyle's face in his hands and looking directly into his storm-gray eyes. "I've been ready since the day I met you." And as the golden afternoon light continued to stream through their windows, illuminating everything they had built and everything they would build together, Philip Nguyen Robinson kissed his husband and thought about how sometimes the most frightening dares led to the most beautiful discoveries, and how sometimes the greatest act of faith was simply allowing yourself to be loved exactly as you are.